Hello, thank you, and welcome. Sorry about last week, and we're going to get right into a couple assignments, okay? Also, starting this Thursday, I am out of excuses for grading your papers. I'm going to be observed, and I have just gone crazy with it. I have a basically a 30-page assignment with 200 footnotes. Um, Prepping for my observation. So I'm sorry. I hope you guys are doing okay. Jacob, Caleb, you guys have anything to say before we start? Any questions, concerns, comments?
None from me.
Okay. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jacob.
no, I think I'm
Okay,
good.
thank you as well, Caleb. Okay, so what we have here, right, is great man history. It is does not imply that the people that are being studied are great men morally. It just is pertains to causation in history, which is very argumentative, and it assumes that people in positions of great power were very influential in turning events in the directions in which they went. Okay. So the first number starts with the establishment of a second party system, right? And in great man fashion, it single handedly blames Hamilton for stirring up a liberal opposition party and the beginning of our two party system, which you won't find in the Constitution. Okay. So, anyway, I put in my 2 cents at the beginning. I don't believe that Hamilton was that far to the right. Remember, in the Estates General during the French Revolution, those who wanted traditional um, institutions and practices maintained sat on the right side of the Estates General, and those who wanted change, especially radical change, sat on the left side of the Estates General. And it's kind of caught to this day with liberal conservative left and right. So I don't believe as a conservative that Hamilton was that far to the right. He wanted a democratic republic. He wanted it constitutional with checks and balances. He wanted it federal with not just the central government prevailing, but the states sharing power. And he was an abolitionist. And yeah, he wasn't for an established church or established standing army. He wasn't for an American aristocracy entitled to certain positions and privileges. He was for a capitalist economy, albeit not a laissez-faire one, right? As he intervenes in the economy, instead of government let it be, it was government, try to get things going. So at any rate, he becomes the appointed Secretary of the Treasury, and right away he does things that were perceived to be uber conservative. Okay. So sometimes, right, perception is reality. And that's what we're continuing on number one is that the perception of him and his policies appeared to be excessively conservative. Okay. So, firstly, right, with the states versus central government, you know that the liberals of that time on the left were libertarians. Things have quite switched by now, right? But government don't tread on me, and they believed, like in the Scottish Enlightenment, that things were safer in more um, provincial, local, and state levels. That governors would be more, and I don't mean a governor, I mean politicians, would be more accountable to their people. And so he makes it clear, right, that he wants a strong executive that flexes its muscles. So that's strike number one with the liberals. Okay, he takes over the state's debts, and the idea is what the federal government does for you for good today, it could do for ill tomorrow. And so now they're getting involved in the state's budgets, right, and to their creditors, and that was seen as an infringement on their sovereignty, their economic sovereignty. Um, he also wanted to subsidize, right, help pay for the costs of production for key industries that he thought America needed to eventually become self-sufficient, right? And so, the first major industry that will take off will be textiles, clothing. And then we'll get into metallurgical objects, and we'll have the beginnings of mass production in no time at all, with the introduction of interchangeable parts by the early 1800s. So at any rate, here, right, who even begins to have the capital, right, to begin a big venture? And of course, what I didn't mention also, what he wanted to subsidize was infrastructure, obviously. He wanted transportation and communication to connect the different regions commercially to one another. And so he wanted roads and canals and eventually railroads. I'm sure he would have been great with, had he not been killed, etc. So at any rate, he's for the federal government subsidizing these big businesses, okay? And then he'll pay for it. He instituted taxes from the executive cabinet, which had not been elected by the citizens of the states. And so that's taxation without representation. And we fought strongly for or against that in the War for Independence, clearly, at least in our rhetoric. And so at any rate, there are a couple more strikes there. And he wanted to protect the nascent, as they're called, the beginning, burgeoning factories and companies. And so he was for import tariffs, which artificially raised the prices of competing goods from Europe and made Americans buy the lesser quality, higher priced American-made products instead. So again, it seemed like he was in cahoots with big business. Then also to raise money is he sold bonds, bond certificates. And that is when you basically lend money to the government and you expect the money back with interest. And of course, who has the extra money to purchase bond certificates, with the exception of soldiers who had been promised such for their service. And even a lot of them had gotten rid of their bond certificates because they saw them at one time as worthless, which they virtually had become at one time. And big speculators, right? Guys that want to buy low and sell high, that are wealthy, bought up those bond certificates, so had the money owed to them instead of the soldiers. And Hamilton said, hey, a deal's a deal. No one had a gun to their head. They sold those bond certificates. We got to pay back the rich who bought them, rightfully. So just one thing after another, right, with this guy. The taxes, right? He put on luxury goods like tea, ironically, coffee, whiskey, etc. And the whiskey distillers oftentimes could not compete in wheat production with big business cash crop farmers. So in not being able to compete with them, it was cheaper and quicker. I don't know if it was quicker, but it was cheaper to distill their wheat into whiskey and sell it. And so they had to help pay for that tax as well. And so they were not happy about that. So they formed a whiskey rebellion. And a lot of people were waiting to see how the government of the first president of this new republic was going to respond to its first rebellion. And they made it clear that this was no longer the Confederation. This is no longer Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. But they're going to make it clear that law and order was going to preside. So he raised an army of 13,000, bigger than the Continental Army against Great Britain, to squash fellow American farmers, distillers of whiskey. And that did not go well with the public as far as his public persona either. All right. And then also, right, to help facilitate all this is he instituted a national bank. And you have to remember that Great Britain had a national bank that was part public and part private, just like ours. So it looked like we were following Great Britain instead of having a new, capitalist economy. And so that also did not go over well. And then when they defended it in the Supreme Court, they used that scary clause, the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, that because they had the right to collect taxes from one state to another, they had a right, it was necessary and proper in having a national bank. So the conservative judges picked by the conservative Washington ended up siding with Hamilton. which just further angered the liberals. George Washington was aware of this. He did not want partisanship of two parties or more. He thought that that was just the opposite of the Roman idea of civic virtue, that you don't act like a faction, a group that shares the same economic self-interest primarily, but you should put what's best for the entire republic first and foremost in your thoughts and in your policies, etc. So he did not apparently want to see this happen, but it happened nevertheless. So what he tried to do is he tried to convey himself as being the father figure above the fray between the liberals and the conservatives, trying to play the middle. Okay, the impartial father figure. So to the conservatives, he was kind of scarce with his public persona and how often he would show himself. He would deliberately show up late to add the sense of expectation and anxiety and enthusiasm for his person and for his position. He also, for the conservatives, he put in conservative Supreme Court justices. He also was the first president to issue the proclamation of executive privilege, that he didn't have to share certain information with the press nor with Congress. He also unilaterally, on his own, declared neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars. And there's nowhere in Article 2 that says the executive can dictate, such a American foreign policy, during a world war over in Europe. So all those things were, and of course he put some conservatives in his cabinet, they made the conservatives happy and made them feel like he was one of them. But for the liberals, right, and trying to seem impartial, he relinquished his sword to the Confederation prior to this, right, and said he was not going to become a military dictator, as did Simon Bolivar in South America. He established press conferences. He engaged in goodwill tours. He was very tolerant of a hostile press. There was the Aurora and the National Gazette, and they both lambasted him and his administration, and he let that happen, claiming, right, that rightfully that was their First Amendment right. And so he did things, and also he put some liberals in his cabinet, like Thomas Jefferson, their leader, as his Secretary of State. So at any rate, but despite his attempts to appear neutral, Alexander Hamilton made enough noise, angered enough people, that a liberal oppositional party arose because of his seemingly excessively conservative actions and policies. Okay. Then going on to number 2, this one is favorable by McCullough to John Adams. He contends basically that it was a personal virtue of John Adams that rendered him failing to become reelected as the first one-term president, as our second president. Remember, John Adams, just as much, if not more, than Alexander Hamilton, had some ugly quotes whereby he appeared to be more conservative than he really was. He supposedly said, basically that the masses are asses, that democracy, as the Greeks had said, as we've already spoken about, has devolved into chaos and then tyranny, with a demagogue taking over. And so he made that clear. When the French Revolution broke out, he made it very clear his opposition to such. And there were a lot of Americans who formed Jacobin clubs. The Jacobins, right, were the ones that took over from the Gironde in the French Revolution and made the French Revolution as radical as it became. He thought too radical, especially in their attack upon the Catholic Church and the doctrines of Christianity. So, because he was adamantly Christian. And so he made it very clear he was no friend of the French Revolution and Napoleon and his Napoleonic Code. He also, the French were, trying to blockade the English and they were confiscating our merchants' supplies that were en route to his enemy, and he was not compensating them. And there were already notions of international rights and international laws and rules in the conduct of war. It's called just war theory, and it emanated with arguably St. Augustine in the Roman Catholic Church. And it's a very fascinating topic in and of itself. But they were violating what was already seen to be international rights long before Geneva. And well, not long before Geneva, but about 5 decades from it. And so he raised a navy and had them engage in a quasi or almost war. And really, they had battles. We lost men, we killed men, and the Congress constitutionally had not raised an army and had not declared war. So that technically could be construed as unconstitutional, right? Then in addition to that, he seemed to be in favor of his Federalist allies' laws that were very constitutionally dubious or doubtful during these Napoleonic Wars and his quasi-war. Well, what they did is they established one law called the Alien Act, and the Alien Act gave Congress's power over immigration to the president and said that he could deport radical French immigrants from the country. Then the Sedition Act greatly curtailed or cut short our First Amendment right. If you in any way were trying to foment a rebellion against the government, trying to in any way commit libel, right? Like deliberate slander that is not true against the government, then you were not allowed that First Amendment right to do so. However, with these laws, right, is we know from this biography by McCullough, excuse me, we know from this biography that he did not enforce them worth a darn. And that was deliberate because they went against his conscience and he knew that they were constitutionally doubtful. So that angered the conservatives. And then Haiti had a black slave rebellion under, I'm going to butcher this name, Toussaint Louverture. And he recognized Haiti because he was an abolitionist and he thought good for the slaves, kicking the French out. And that angered people, conservatives and liberals, who were, in favor of slavery, or at least the states determining if they want slavery, and for disenfranchising or not allowing citizenship rights to African Americans. So at any rate, he also sent pro-French ambassadors to France because he didn't want to go to actual war with them. And the conservatives wanted him to go further than his quasi-war and actually conduct a war against Napoleon. And he wouldn't go that far. He thought that it was immoral and we were not prepared and we should not do so. So that alienated conservatives. And then there was a guy named Fry, and in Fry's rebellion, they wanted him executed because at a rally, and he actually tried to, he had people try to and actually engage in murderous acts against law enforcement. But he looks at it, right? And the conservatives said that there needs to be a statement made to the country and he needs to be executed. But as a former lawyer himself, he looks over the facts and he decides that Mr. Fries was in no way guilty of provoking that violence. So he pardons him. So basically, right, because John Adams had a personal conscience that he followed at all costs and a strong backbone and independence of mind, he alienated both sides. And it was that very virtue of his that rendered him defeated in his bid for re-election. Okay, so it's actually a virtue that does him in. according to David McCullough. Then you have a fictitious write-up. I'm not sure how well I did this. It's much better when you actually just read the chapter in the book. Richard Hofstadter, His American Political Tradition. So often, books written in the 60s are considered obsolete now. They've found so much information since then. They've had so many new revisionist, arguments made against old ones that usually 1960s historical works just don't hold up anymore. His is an exception. People still consider his book a classic, and it's very well written, and it's very clever. And what he does, right, is he does great man history, and he does a psychological take on one American leader after another from chapter to chapter. And about the third chapter, he does one on Jefferson. And I call it the mommy and daddy thesis, right? Supposedly, there was a great gulf socioeconomically between his mom and dad. His mom was a Randolph, and that was a very high-ranking Scottish noble name and lineage. He was entitled to be a hand-picked councilman under the governor rather than merely running for the lower branch in the assembly. But he refused to be chosen as a councilman and insisted upon being elected like any other colonist to the assembly. His maternal grandparents, the parents of his mother, came to live with his father, who was a commoner, Peter Jefferson, a yeoman farmer, a subsistence farmer. And under the laws of coverture, his dad received everything of his wife's. And the in-laws were certainly not happy about that. And they supposedly constantly reminded their son-in-law, Peter Jefferson, that he was a commoner, that they were noble, and that he was not worthy of the hand of their daughter. This greatly hurt and angered young Jefferson and made him feel extremely torn and awkward. But he is depicted in such a way as that he's very fragile and he's very unconfrontational. And so he fails to stand up for his father, which he wants to do supposedly internally. And so what he does is he grows up and almost in an act of passive aggression, he becomes a spokesman for the common yeoman farmer, for the common subsistence farmer growing his own food, not commercially connected like a businessman, right, and selling one crop, and not given in to greed and the vagaries of the market. And he keeps his economic independence, and that in turn keeps his independence of mind. Remember, he also said that there was a natural sagacity to the common man, that the average man had street smarts, that he had worldly wisdom that would help him in participating in government, despite his lack of education. So at any rate, you see him long after the death of his father, almost as if he is still trying to earn the approval of his father and trying to, perhaps with a sense of a little bit of wealth guilt connected to his mom and all the privileges of his lifestyle because of that connection to his mom. He had the finest of tutors. He went to Paris often. He went to Europe for his education, etc. He tries to compensate for that and show himself as a man of the people who is unpretentious and does not have that sense of entitlement that his mother and his mother's parents had and had demonstrated during his childhood. So it's a real fascinating topic. It's a real fascinating chapter. If you ever have a chance to read American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter. Jefferson felt compelled by circumstances beyond his control to violate his own rhetoric. You have a few presidents, right, that are depicted as enigmas, as puzzles, right? They're difficult to try to capture what was really going on in their head, because there were some apparent deep contradictions between their rhetoric, what they preached, and their actions, what they actually did, okay? And I would argue that 3 of those presidents throughout entire U.S. history have been Thomas Jefferson, as well as probably Woodrow Wilson, and William McKinley. All right. So Jefferson's one of them. He was this libertarian liberal who took a strong stance in 2 instances against slavery, and wanted land for the common man to be accessible to him. And he becomes quite conservative when he becomes president in 1800 to 1808. So what happens, right? Some people say, right, that people become more conservative in age. They become more conservative with power. Some people even believe that there was a almost a conspiracy. No one won the majority of electoral points in 1800, so it went to the top 2. He and Aaron Burr in 1800, and the House had to decide who would become the next president. And some people believe that he promised the House, unbeknownst to the press, that he would not mess with Hamilton's system and that he would be much less radical than he claimed he would be in the past. So who knows? But according to Alan Brinkley, right, what he contends is you once again get a picture of him as being very quite fragile and unconfrontational, non-confrontational. And so when he bucks up against circumstances that he feels are overwhelming, he turns from being an idealistic politician, right? In idealism, I just defined to myself as you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be, and you want to improve the world, and you have these grand ideas for improvement, to a pragmatist. And a pragmatist, right, just simply is practical. He doesn't care about being consistent ideologically, being liberal or conservative. He just wants to make the practical solution in a given situation that yields the best immediate or long-term practical results. Okay? So you get one instance after another in Alan Brinkley's textbook of him doing just that. So first of all, with Hamilton's system, he hires a pretty radical French Secretary of the Treasury named Albert Gallatin. And Gallatin does a tour and comes back and tells him, Mr. Jefferson, there are too many loans out to too many businesses. This federal system is connected and subsidizing way too much, that if you just let it all just shrink up and disappear, that it will have very harmful and long-term economically harmful consequences. So supposedly, begrudgingly, Hamilton says, fine, I'll let Hamilton's system, or Jefferson says, fine, I'll let Hamilton's system continue. Not only did he let it continue, but he also was quite responsible himself for subsidizing the first interstate road helped to be paid for by the federal government, known as the Cumberland Road. Okay? And remember, in his rhetoric, he wasn't for that. And by the way, when I talk about his rhetoric, most of that comes from a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. All right, in that book, Thomas Jefferson is writing to a French friend, and the friend is asking him a myriad of questions about a myriad of topics over in the U.S., in the colonies. And Jefferson gives his 2 cents on every topic and kind of philosophically waxes about, his liberal beliefs on each topic. Madison and others got together his correspondence and put it into a book and had it published. And so, for instance, like I said, he absolutely writes against slavery. He writes in favor of decentralized government. Going back to the Angles and the Saxons, the idea of having villages and councils and judges of 100 inhabitants. He wants to err on the side of democracy versus aristocracy, and having the lower branches be predominant over the upper branches that are not directly elected by citizens. When he was Virginia governor, he disestablished the church, the Anglican Church. When he was governor, he tampered with ideas of giving lands out to the poor white people of Virginia in the West, albeit they were Native Americans' lands, but he was trying to help them out. So he seemed to be liberal when he was young, but not anymore. So at any rate, in addition to that, he sees an idea to have everybody educated with a nationally subsidized public school system. And the state representatives in Congress would not have anything to do with this. Many of them, right, had a monopoly. They had the money to have private tutoring and private school education for their kids. So why would they want to be taxed to enable the poor to bring their kids to the same public schools as their rich kids so that they can compete with them? So it didn't work. This crusade against ignorance that he wanted to carry out. Then in addition to that, the Louisiana Territory, right? What a swath of land that was. Remember, this is not just the state of Louisiana, okay? We're talking parts of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, parts of Wyoming, Colorado. It's just several states, right? A big swath throughout the center of our present country. So at any rate, it was owned by Napoleon at the time and went back and forth between the French and the Spanish several times. And when Napoleon, right, he gets his men to be able to, at first, offer to spend money, millions. I believe it was at one time it was 5 million to purchase Louisiana only, present day the state of Louisiana area and around New Orleans. And then the French unexpectedly offered and said, what if we grant you the whole territory? What would you pay us? And they didn't even have to double their money or scarcely double their money to buy the whole thing. So they took the deal and they ran. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say in Article 2 that the president can purchase land. And as a libertarian, Jefferson had always said, if it's not explicitly given as a power in the Constitution, you can't do it. Right? That's a first step toward tyranny. But he did it anyway. And he said future generations would forgive him for the benefits that would accrue from buying all that land and offering it in the future to the poor citizens. So at any rate, he does so anyway. He says that Napoleon is mercurial. Mercurial is like bipolar. And he can't be trusted. And on a whim, he might attack us with his property along the Mississippi being contiguous or touching our property. He was a dangerous neighbor to have. So that was another reason why Jefferson pragmatically chose, we must buy this territory from Napoleon. Well, then he finds out that the inhabitants therein are Spanish, and the Spaniards, right, are quite conservative. A lot of them are criollos, pure Spaniards. Well, I don't know about pure Spaniards, that's after what we've gone over, but Spaniards, right, nevertheless, born in the Americas, very much for aristocratic government, etc., Roman Catholic, etc. Then you also had the French, and the French had Creoles, likewise, very conservative, very wealthy, powerful, very elitist, very aristocratic in their tastes and their political persuasion. And then also you had the Cajuns, and the Cajuns came from Acadia, Canada, and they've been forced during the French and Indian War, forcefully deported to Louisiana for their rebellions. And so they were known as being a defiant demographic of people. And then you had Native Americans and other, quote, ne'er-do-wells who were ambitious and perhaps untrustworthy and wanting to head west. So he didn't trust the demographics of people that were in that territory. So he handpicked 21 men to lead the North and 21 men to lead the South. So Mr. Democracy, right, err on the side of democracy, while it was a territory and while he was president, said they are not going to have democratic government. They're not ready for it yet. I don't trust them. And also in his defense, Mr. Wilkerson and Aaron Burr were arguably connected to a conspiracy to sell that land to a foreign country. So that didn't help his distrust issues. But again, he went against his own rhetoric that way. Then in addition to that, you had Yusuf Karamanli, the Basha or governor of Tunisia. He was under a sultanate. And I don't know, I don't remember if it was the Ottoman Turks or not. But at any rate, he was under a Muslim sultanate, and he had a policy of piracy in the Mediterranean. And we had many of our merchants heading to the Mediterranean to sell their produce, especially farmers. And he had a policy of using his corsairs, his legalized pirates, to stop their ships, confiscate their goods, take them as hostages, sell them as slaves, or wait for ransom to be paid for their freedom, etc. And so Jefferson felt as if supposedly this could not continue at the rate it was happening. And also he wanted to eventually end Hamilton's system. And he thought the best way of ending the system was by proving that it was not needed in balancing the budget. And this was harming the national budget, supposedly, as well. So he unilaterally, on his own, sends the USS Philadelphia to punish Yusuf Karamanli. And instead, they get tricked and they get caught up on shore in their ship, and they're captured as prisoners. All right. In addition to that, unbeknownst to Congress, he sends a man named William Eaton, Eaton, to find the older brother of Yusuf Karamanli, named Hamed, and have a coup, raise an army of Egyptians, have a coup and violently overthrow Yusuf Karamanli, and put his brother Hamed on the throne, with Hamed, of course, promising no more piracy. And it failed. All right, this venture failed. The Congress finds out about both these ventures, and they're furious, right? Because constitutionally, the president's not supposed to be doing this stuff without the consent of Congress. And so that's just one more contradiction of Jefferson's. But it's one more instance, right, in which Jefferson felt that this was the pragmatic, practical thing to do at the moment, considering the circumstances. That something needed to be quickly done to rectify the situation. So at any rate, they eventually conceded to a war and known as the Tripolitan or the Barbary Coast War with Tunisia. And it kind of fights to a standstill. And we had to pay money to purchase the freedom of the American prisoners, all except one who, in return for his freedom there under the Basha, became Muslim. And yeah, and took that deal and didn't come back to the U.S. So all this happens, right? And remember, when he denounced King George III during the Declaration of Independence, he used as an example of the arbitrary authority of a king, that when his ego is bruised or for the slightest personal reasons, he sends young men as soldiers to their deaths in faraway distant lands, unbeknownst and without the cooperation of his parliament. And that's exactly what he does here. So that's quite ironic. All right. And then slavery. Of course, as you could easily guess, Jefferson felt as if, supposedly, according to his own words, that he was ahead of his own time, and that the South was not ready to even consider seriously the emancipation of her slaves. So he felt that his slaves that he personally had, oftentimes around 160, were better off under him, a benevolent ruler who never physically harmed them, than under someone else if he were to sell them. And he was afraid that if he were to emancipate them, that he would look like a radical and lose the support of Southern Democrats. And also, he contended that because of all of the injustices that were meted out upon the slaves, that years of injustice had developed a sense of resentment and rage. And that he said, we have the wolf by the ears and we dare not let them go. We dare not let go of those ears or the wolf's going to attack us. So he was also afraid that if we emancipated the slaves, there'd be a mass black rebellion. And that frightened the heck out of him. So he did dabble with ideas, as some other Americans did, so-called abolitionists and so forth, who dabble with the idea of sending them back to Africa, repatriation. Also, he said there's no better example of the delusion of the master than in having paramours for his black female slaves. Because can they really say no? Are they really in a position to say no to his overtures? And so that he's basically living a lie. And that's exactly what he does. His wife dies, giving birth to his second daughter. And he was a widow for a while. And Sally Hemings was a beautiful woman, black woman. And she caught his eye and they became lovers. And he had about 4 kids, biracial kids with her. And so she tried one time refusing to leave Paris with him and come back to the States if he did not promise to free her children, their children. He had issues with freeing them because he knew everybody was watching him. So his oldest, Beverly, was a son, and Beverly was promised at age 18 he could be freed. Well, 18 came, and news of his love affair with Sally Hemings came out in the press, and he said that he needed to lay low for a while, and he told Beverly he could not free him at that time. Beverly ran away, and I think they eventually got him back and eventually set him free. But it really marred his relationship with his oldest son, Beverly. Then you had a daughter, and I think her name was Maria. But at any rate, this daughter of Sally and Thomas Jefferson, she too was a beautiful girl. And his second daughter, whose birth had brought about the death of his wife, was in a abusive marriage, and he convinces her to leave him with the child, his grandchild, and come back and live with him at Monticello. So she does, and she finds that he's living with Sally Hemings as his lover, and he has these biracial kids, and she is not happy, and she is very jealous. So she mistreats Sally Hemings. She mistreats the daughter of Sally Hemings and of Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson does not show the backbone to stand up for them. So eventually, he finds himself so far in debt that he gives all of his assets, his property that was worth something, to his daughters, and which included his slaves. So he did not even free his slaves at death, including Sally, his lover. So boy, what an enigma, right? And supposedly the chip off the old block was his youngest son, Eston. And Eston was like a black version of Thomas Jefferson. He was intellectual. He loved to read. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He loved music. And they got along quite well. And he ended up freeing Eston. But just what a puzzle of a man, you know? So at any rate, I have here, he was not a hypocrite. He didn't change with power or age. He didn't cut a deal. But when he saw forces that he wasn't man enough to take on confrontationally, he turned to become a pragmatist and make practical decisions that he thought yielded the best results. All right. Then we have Fogel and Ingerman were wrong. Fogel and Ingerman wrote a book called Time on the Cross. And what they contended, right, was that slavery was a profitable, well-working economic institution, partly because the slaves bought into it and worked hard. And the slaves bought into it and worked hard, partly because they were given incentives by many masters to do so, but also because the masters materially treated them quite well. And that they treated them quite well, not out of humanitarianism or this paternal sense of responsibility as their father figure, as they would say in the South, but because they were expensive investments. So no different from like a horse that you buy. You want to feed it the best of food. You don't want to whip it and harm it because you want it to be as strong and effective as possible as your chattel or movable property. So there's just too much evidence to the contrary. There's evidence of slaves not quite getting enough to eat almost anywhere, showing great desperation to try to capture supplemental sources of food, even when they knew they would be whipped and greatly punished for doing so. There were loved ones that were sold apart from one another. There was great fear amongst quite a few masters, as well as their hired overseers, the hated middlemen, such as sleeping with their guns and their quarters locked and with guards guarding them during their sleep, because such was their guilty conscience and their lack of a good, healthy relationship with their slaves, that they were constantly afraid of a rebellion. All right. Slaves oftentimes ran away to see one another, knowing the great danger of getting whipped, or the second time sold, or even worse, being mutilated. There was a great recognition amongst masters that they needed a certain types of safety valves for the slaves to kind of let out their anger, their frustration, and their misery. And there's plenty of evidence of that. There's evidence in the slaves' activities, right? That they in their music and dances, their language that they sometimes devised that the white overseers and masters couldn't understand, in their extra, their recreational activities, etc. And then, of course, in their acts of defiance, of outright defiance, that they were not happy, that they're instead quite miserable. So this thesis just does not hold water. And what's amazing to me is that it was written in the 1970s, right after the Civil Rights Movement. That was a gutsy thesis. Then lessons on power in the early Republic South. So see my notes to myself that I should have taken out after I wrote this, but they're telling of what I'm going to write. As seen with Gabriel Prosser, sometimes slaves had unique characteristics that made them stand out amongst other slaves. Sometimes they were given positions and privileges that other slaves didn't have, and it raised their hopes and their self-esteem. Sometimes they were given a taste of freedom, and after given such a taste, they would be willing to sacrifice their lives to enhance it or keep it. Okay. And sometimes there were divisive issues that were going on amongst white Americans, liberal and conservative, and slaves were quick in using good timing with some of their uprisings or would-be uprisings that were reported just before they could be carried out. With Denmark Vesey, he was given a cosmopolitan or citizen of the whole world outlook because he's able to work on a ship and go to many different countries. He received favorable connections to black and white artisans in the city. And of course, he became disappointed with limited little tastes of freedom that only made him want complete freedom all the more. As far as sex and slaves, the wrath of slave men became so pronounced and well known that it became quite frequent that masters would tell their hired overseers, follow my example and do not try to have your way with a married slave woman. The wrath of the married men, slave men, is just, there's too much to lose. The upward mobility of, quote, fancy girls like Sally Hemings, like women who became the connected lovers, paramours of some of these masters. They knew exactly what they were doing. Some of them were able to gain their freedom. And matter of fact, under stats in cities like Charleston, South Carolina, the majority of manumissions, right, of legalized emancipation, freedom to slaves, the majority were given to black slave women and their biracial kids. So you do the math, right? They're willing to have an affair with a powerful white man on their plantation in return for eventually getting their freedom and freedom for their children. Right? And white women began to fight back, not just against black women and just blaming them as scapegoats in these situations. All right, so that's what you have here. The case of Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, I believe, both cases were found out before they could be carried out, but they could have been really big as far as the connections, the swath of land that it was to cover, the amount of guns and ammunition they were able to get a hold of. It could have been scary, but they were found out. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm trying to put a formula up for rebellion amongst slaves. Okay, so oftentimes the leaders were people who had reason to have a higher self-esteem than the other slaves. They had types of privileges, opportunities that others didn't. They got tastes of freedom. They had physical characteristics and personality characteristics that rendered them natural leaders. Some of them had connections with white merchants and white bourgeois people from the city and middle-class people and skilled workers. And the latter groups were willing to collude with them. But again, in these two big cases, they were found out before they could be carried out. All right, so anyway, moving on. Slaves and the alleged utility of religious instruction. Okay, so slaves, right? You have certain interpretations, and all that I simply do, getting it from this book, is that all the above had some truth to them. And the book we're talking about, it's not the Black Church. That's not it. I'm looking at my footnotes real quickly here. It's neither of those two. Slave Religion by Albert Rabateau. That's a very good book, and that's where I'm getting most of my information. Okay? So at any rate, To some people, right, initially, the Anglicans that were in charge of the official churches of the southern colonies, they allowed begrudgingly missionaries to come and convert the slaves, but there were conditions on it. They had to literally take out the book of Exodus, the story of the Hebrews being God's chosen people, and they were enslaved by the Pharaoh of Egypt. And God, through his 10 mighty plagues and his miraculously parting of the Red Sea, got them out of their captivity. So you could see why that might give a sense of great hope and embolden slaves to hear that story. So they literally took that out. They had to, if they wanted to preach to the black slaves. So to some people, right, there was a great fear that Christianity would embolden the slaves to rebel. And in some cases, as you'll see in this number, that was true. You have verses, right, where God is not a respecter of persons. He does not keep in mind someone's social status, ethnicity, nationality, age, gender, nothing. That we're all equal in his eyes. We're all no different from one another. You have the Beatitudes of Jesus saying, "Blessed are the meek and the poor and those who are mourning now. They'll be comforted," right? And so you have this kind of, bottom up, and this is what Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, hated about Christianity. He thought it was an upside down morality, a slave morality. And so it does empower sometimes slaves, right? Then you also have some of them who just learn to cope, and that it's a source of release, right? Of catharsis. Catharsis, right, is letting out your negative emotions in a non-harmful way, like punching a punching bag. And so some found catharsis with Christianity, and it kept them from rebelling. But that's all it did. It didn't make them love their owners and their overseers. It just kept them from killing them. All right. And just waiting for the by and by, waiting for heaven and their rewards after death. And then, of course, right. And so you had this sense of, once again, lifting them up and giving them what they needed to cope. And then you also have the cases, right, in which it did serve as like a Vicodin pill, right, the opiate of the masses, as the Marxists would say, that it helped take away that sting of their anger and rage and helped them to become more submissive, more docile, more obedient as Christians. So really you have examples of all the above, okay, as far as effects upon slaves of Christianity. It's a very interesting book. All right. So yeah, so look at the Louisiana Territory there, how big of a swath of land that is. There you have Tripoli in Tunisia and the Barbary Coast, where we had the Tripolitan War. This is Sally Hemings right here. This is a meeting with a black preacher. And outside of their regular services, they slowly began to be given permission to have their own black services with a black preacher. Also, I have recently written another section, and I don't know why it's not on here, and I'm going to replace it, okay? With the exception, if it's too late. If this is already due, then I may not. But the other section, I'll just talk about it just in case I don't add it. Because like I said, if this thing is due like today or tomorrow, then I'm going to keep it as it is, and I'm just going to talk about it. If it's due in future days, then I'm gonna actually copy and paste this extra section, okay, that I've written this semester. But basically, right, it just focuses upon the agency of the slaves, right? remember that African Americans don't want to just have their ancestors known as poor, pitiful victims of everything that happened to them. That they made decisions that mattered. They used whatever sense of power and autonomy, being their own human beings with free will, to do what they could, and they absolutely did so. So we have that, right, and that, like I said, and what they did on their free time, with their music and dancing, with their formation of their own language and their own kind of cross-African culture that they created. Because remember, sadly, kind of like a divide and conquer tactic, a lot of the slave owners were for mixing the tribe affiliations of their slaves. So they couldn't understand one another's language. They didn't have a sense of camaraderie with one another. So hence you had Igbo, Yoruba, Dahomey, you had Asante, you had Congolese, you had all these different groups of African tribes that they tried to mix up on their southern plantations deliberately. There's evidence for that. And so they try to overcome that and make their own African culture, their own African American culture. Okay, and they did so. Food, speech, literature. Some of them were literate illegally, right? Music. Like I said, recreational activities, etc. All right. And sometimes they became with their agency quite defiant. Once again, like I mentioned, it was quite often that they would leave the quarters, even when they were locked in. They would find ways of climbing out the chimney and going to see loved ones at night. That was very common to happen. They would sometimes start getting together and making weapons out of utensils and tools and farm implements and start planning rebellion. They would run away. When they were given free passes on certain occasions of holidays, etc., to go see loved ones with the proper papers on them, they would sometimes tie some type of natural, like ivy, botanical element. That was very strong. They would tie it from one tree to another across the pass where the slave patrols would come to literally trip their horses, even if it wasn't for anything militarily planned, just to do it. They had parodies where they would act like they're white masters and white Southerners, and they would make fun of them through parody, right? Pretending to be them and using sarcasm and irony, etc. They had their own plays and so forth that they got a kick out of. They like to play very physical sports to get out their frustration, etc. So you have lots of instances of the slaves' agency in doing things to try to make a difference in their lives, make their lives a little more palatable that they could handle, get a little bit of revenge. And of course, right, you had passive aggression in the form of working slowly on purpose, breaking tools and acting ignorant of doing so as if it were an accident. You had all kinds of stuff like that. And then, of course, right, you have the enigma, the puzzle of the domestic slave. Because yes, in the previous section, the two cases of these rebellions that could have been very big did not happen because a domestic slave told on them just before the time of attack. And so they did have that kind of Uncle Tom reputation, but a lot of them were much more complex and sharper than that. A lot of them, they had their own agenda, and they used their knowledge of the weaknesses, the sense of vulnerability of each of the white family members, they use them sometimes against them for their own benefit in a myriad of ways. All right. So that would have been another section had I put it in here. Okay. So at any rate, so far, are there any questions?
All the sections that were down from section 4 were not in the Canvas.
Oh, they were not. Okay,
No.
have you checked them as of today?
Yes.
And they're still not there?
No, they're still not there.
Oh no, because I'm gonna have to go to student view and see what I did wrong. Because yeah, on my side they're there. Shoot.
Were you talking, was this last bit about the one that's due today or about the one that's due next week?
She's probably talking about both.
I was talking about the one that's due today.
The one that's due today. Okay, that's the one we just did.
The one that's due next week is the 1812
That's right.
PBS video.
Okay. So the one that we just did, this slavery one, let me go as soon as we're done to student view and see what I've done wrong. Because like I said, on my side, I kind of pulled an all-nighter last night, once again, because of a observation that I have coming up in a couple days in a in-person class. I realized that I've been behind, and like 2 a.m, I went through every one of all 6 of my classes and put everything up to speed. So on my end, when I go to your class, I have both of these. But if it doesn't show up, I'm hoping if it doesn't show up for you, Alexis, that it's not going to show up for me either when I do student view, and I could figure how I could rectify the publication of it. Because yeah, on my side, it's showing. On my side, I put it there. But I'm glad you told me that, as I will certainly double check as soon as I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. And not to mention, right? If it's not on there yet and it's due today, I'm clearly going to extend the due date. Okay, I made that promise to you guys earlier in the semester, right? That any mistakes on my part, I don't want you ever to suffer for it, to have fewer days to do something because I didn't post it in time. No way. To me, the very least I can do is to extend the due date.
I was talking about some of the sections on the assignment. The assignment is on there. It was just
so
some of the
perhaps
sections.
I posted the wrong one. You know what?
Okay.
I bet I posted the Early Republic and it doesn't have the slavery sections.
Yeah, I don't think it has the slavery sections because
Aha, that's what happened. So I
yeah.
did post it okay as far as like getting it posted for you, but I just chose the wrong document. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very sorry, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. Okay. What I'm going to go ahead and ask is if you guys can continue to just turn in any section you like, and I'm going to repost it with the slavery and ask you that, like, hey, just in sometime before the next test, before test 2, make sure that you read these sections on slavery in preparation for the test. And not to mention, if you want to choose one of them instead, again, I'll extend the due date. Okay. So that's the least I can do for making a mistake. So yeah, that makes sense. As I did, I put Early Republic, and I have a separate one that says Early Republic with slavery, and I posted the wrong one. So who did the U.S. fight in the War of 1812? How is Canada connected to the story? What reasons are given for poor American military prowess? This is basically like the lowest level of learning, right? This is basically just recitation, what's the word they use, the metaphor, regurgitation of basic facts that you hear in the video. Okay, so I'm not really proud of this assignment. I like my argumentative framework much better. I think it creates critical thinking much more effectively than this does. But I just haven't had time to formulate an intelligent argument about the War of 1812. is pretty dry and just put in simple narrative, right? Of this happened and that happened and this happened. So it's been more difficult for me to think of an intelligent argument to center it around. And so I put this assignment in very basic form of just regurgitating what you see on the video. Okay. So it's the War of 1812. We fought against Great Britain and the Native American tribes and members of tribes that chose to fight with Great Britain instead of us. A lot of them, by the way, put red ochre on their tomahawks and guns, and we therefore called them red sticks. That was the euphemism we used for the Native Americans who, quote, chose the wrong side and fought with Britain instead of us. So the main red stick that you'll learn about in the video is Tecumseh, a Shawnee military chief. Okay, so the two reasons for fighting, one of them is very apparent as far as our international rights on the high seas as a neutral nation during the Napoleonic Wars. And the British were walking all over that international right that we were supposed to have as a neutral nation. But the second one is a little bit more subtle, and that is provoking or fomenting rebellion amongst our Native Americans. They armed them with their own British guns and made treaties with them, etc., promising an alliance with them against us. So that was the second official reason, in case you don't catch that in the video, was stirring up or fomenting rebellion amongst our natives. All right. I feel like the other stuff is very self-explanatory. Okay. Then you could take a look at this as context. That's kind of just FYI. All right. So absolutely, I will rectify that issue with slavery on the Early Republic handout, even though it's due today or tonight. And like I said, for next week's, it's just very cut and dry, guys. It's just regurgitation of what is covered on a video. And all you have to simply do with this long URL is just simply go to YouTube or whatever source you use and just put in PBS War of 1812 documentary, and you'll get to the right one. As a matter of fact, you might not be seeing this, but if I go to, for instance, I'll share the screen here in just a second. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Then I'm going to go to my Chrome. So hopefully now this is visible for you. And like I said, all I'm going to do is War or PBS War of 1812 documentary. And it's on several, this one right here.
War of 1812.
Britain was in a death struggle with Napoleon Bonaparte on the continent of Europe and on the seven seas at the time. It was a world war that was going on. The only way that Britain could really
So you notice, I think it's that actor Joe Mantegna that speaks between scenes and so forth and narrates. And so that's the one, okay? Just PBS War of 1812. It should be relatively easy to find. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Alexis, again, thank you for bringing that to my attention.
I'm not quite sure how to help you with that.
All right. So are you guys good for next week?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
No problem. All right. So thank you for your input. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. You will receive your extra credit for this. Okay, as I have your names down. and the assignments that you're getting extra credit on. And I intend to give you extra credit on both that are covered. All right. The Early Republic as well as the War of 1812. Okay, so if you guys don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the week, okay? And like I said, as of Thursday, after something important in my career is finished, I'm out of excuses for grading your stuff. All right, so thank you for your patience. All right, so you guys have a good week, okay?
You too. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Jacob.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Jacob
Thank
stole
you,
my
Mia.
words. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Take care.